Action.
God.
Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Matt Harris. He's the author of Second Class Saints. If you don't have your copy, make sure you get an autographed copy by signing up to our contest. Go to gospeltangents.com/contest, and you could win an autographed copy of Matt at the conclusion of this interview. So sign up today. In our next conversation, we're going to go into the 19th century and just do a basic quick dive into what happened in Joseph Smith's lifetime and after. We'll also dive into some modern day issues that look back on some of these times. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. So what I'd like to first do, I remember when we spoke, in fact, this was our first interview, it was about this book.
Which hadn't been named yet.
Yeah, we hadn't been named. But what I'd like to do, because you do, I think in chapter 1, you spend a very short chapter on kind of the priesthood ban in the 19th century. And you noted that there were some black men who held the priesthood. Could you just kind of give us a thumbnail of 19th century policies within the church and blacks?
Yeah, so for years and years and years, the church narrative was that the ban began with the prophet Joseph Smith. And in 1922, Andrew Jensen, who was the assistant church historian, he published, I think it was a 4-volume encyclopedia biography. And just what it is, you just go through alphabetically to different subjects you could look up. And there was one subject in there that came back to bite the church, and the subject was Elijah Abel.
Yes.
And so this is the first time that the saints are reading that there was an early black priesthood holder. And let me tell you, they wrote letters to the First Presidency, to the Quorum of the 12. How could there be a ban with Joseph Smith and Elijah Abel? And Joseph Fielding Smith said, who was then the church historian, Joseph Fielding Smith said that question has come back to haunt us. I wish he never would have included, Jensen, wouldn't have included Elijah Abel in the biography. So they didn't know how to answer it. How can you say the ban began with the prophet, the founding prophet, if a black man's ordained to the priesthood? And so Joseph Fielding Smith was interesting in his responses. One Latter-day Saint inquisitor, he wrote back and he said, there were actually 2 Elijah Abels in Nauvoo. One was white and one was black. I mean, there's no evidence for any of this stuff, but he's trying to work out this narrative. And then a little while later, he gave a different answer, and he said that it was a mistake. And there's no evidence for that either.
Right.
And I'm not here to pick on Joseph Fielding Smith. I'm just merely telling a story that the brethren are trying to understand this and comprehend it. And J. Reuben Clark of the First Presidency was scheduled to give a general conference talk in October of 1954. And it's the only time I've noticed where where at least Clark had acknowledged that there were a few priesthood holders, black priesthood holders. Mostly Elijah Abel was known because of Andrew Jensen. But he acknowledges that there were a few priesthood holders of black African ancestry who held the priesthood. And President McKay nixed the talk. Don't give it.
Really?
Yeah, for 2 reasons. One, I think it was less about the acknowledgement of 3 black. Well, that was part of it. That's not true. Part of it was, we don't want the church to know that there are 3 black priesthood holders. And the other part was, a lot of the talk talked about civil rights, and which I'm sure we'll get into in a minute. But President McKay didn't want President Clark talking about civil rights and bringing attention to it when the civil rights movement was heating up.
Right.
Because it'll bring attention to the race ban. So, all right. So the church for years thought that the ban began with the prophet Joseph Smith. We now know that at least 3 or 4 black men held the priesthood. A couple more probably did, but the evidence is inconclusive. And I think for your listeners, one thing that's really, really interesting is that you can't say that Joseph Smith started the ban and then, had black men ordained under his tutelage. He didn't ordain them personally, but other people did that he knew about. So you can't really say exception, 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 but he was the originator. It doesn't work that way. So Brigham Young, scholars today, and the church has acknowledged that Brigham Young is the founder of the band. But what I want your listeners to know is Brigham Young accepted black priesthood holders at first. He knew about Joseph Ball, a black priesthood holder in Boston, also a branch president. I'll say that again. A black man was a branch president in Boston, Massachusetts.
See, now this makes me, because I know Paul argues, so you're correct. Joseph Ball did hold the priesthood. He had black ancestry.
Yeah.
But Paul Reeve argues that he was so light-skinned, he was listed as white on the census, that people didn't know he was black. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I think, I don't know if I disagree with Paul on that. It's hard to know about racial passing is really interesting. And it's likely that he did pass, racially. Elijah Abel was light-skinned too. He was, I hate to say this, these fractions are ridiculous, but he was what they said at the time, 1/8 black.
Yeah. I know he's listed on census records
or
as
mulatto
or quadroon.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we have...
Quadroon would be 1/4 black, but...
Yeah. But the Joseph F. Smith, as I recall, says that he's 1/8 black. This is what they say in some documents. So the brethren know that he's got African ancestry. It's less clear about Joseph Ball. And I think that Paul's speculation could hold up that, if he's listed as white on the census, it could mean that he was passing as white, but not necessarily, right? The real question is, how did the brethren view him?
Right.
And so Joseph Ball, and there was a guy named William McCary, who was a colorful character in history.
Very.
And
I need you to help me get an interview with Angela Pulley Hudson.
Angela Pulley Hudson, who wrote a nice book about William McCary and his wife. So William McCary has indigenous ancestry, African ancestry. And
he also went by Warner McCary, I believe.
Also went by Warner McCary. So anyway, the upshot of the story is this, is that Brigham Young was fine with Warner McCary. He was fine with Ball and some others, and then they started taking polygamous white wives. That's where it turned south.
Yeah, Walker Lewis's son did as well.
Walker Lewis's son.
And Walker Lewis is interesting because I know there's, I think it was Wilford Woodruff, I remember, called him a fine African, an elder.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they recognize that he has black African ancestry, and they even entrusted him with some ecclesiastical responsibilities.
And he started the NAACP, the precursor.
Well, he was involved in civil rights in and around Boston.
Right.
And which is the hub of abolitionist activity and folks pushing for racial equality.
Another thing Benson would be upset about.
He would have been very upset at that. So he did not believe in racial equality. Anyway, so Brigham Young got word that a couple of these black men were marrying polygamous white wives. And in my opinion, it's not coincidental that just not too long after he learns this, he gives this territorial address in 1852 where he announces for the first time the ban. And he also, and this is going to be jarring for your listeners to hear, but he also announced that if a black and a white man marry, they should lose their lives. They should die. He's talking about blood atonement.
Yeah.
And blood atonement.
Well, because I just had a conversation with Barbara Jones Brown, and she says that people don't understand blood atonement. She's talking in relation to Mountain Meadows, because she said you had to ask to be blood atoned, which clearly Warner McCary wouldn't have been asked.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, he did said we ought to kill them, and their blood ought to be spilt.
Yeah, I mean, the idea about this is, of course, that interracial marriage is so grievous because there's a pure white race, and it would be sullied with an interracial relationship, whether it's black or brown or anybody else. But in this case, Brigham Young's racism was so intense, it was directed towards black people. And we can talk about pure lineages and all that stuff in just a minute. But that was the idea, that you would sully a racially pure bloodline with the seed of Cain, as the church and Protestant groups had called it.
Isn't
And-
that how we make them white and delightsome?
Well, but see,
I mean, I say that as a joke,
yeah.
but isn't that why Joseph Smith specifically directed missionaries to go to the Lamanites, was so that
Yes.
they could intermarry with them and make them white and delightsome?
Yeah, which is not applied to black people.
Okay.
They were set apart for racism. But
Even Joseph Smith felt that way?
yeah, for Lamanites, for Native Americans.
Yeah, but he felt like blacks would not become white and delightsome.
No, well, there's a difference here. So let's just pause for a quick moment and talk about what the teaching is, the doctrine is.
Okay.
The teaching was that everybody in the human family was white. There was a raceless human family, and they were all white. Some people sinned, and because they sinned, God had cursed them with a black or brown skin. So brown people are afflicted with this mythology too. And so God cursed them with a black or brown skin, and if they repented of their sins, they could lose their curse. And the brethren couldn't.
Curse of the dark skin.
Curse of the dark skin. Now, the scriptures don't talk about, black or brown. They just say dark. So various religious groups, including the Mormons, will interpret that dark skin to mean black or brown. This is not uniquely Latter-day Saint. I just want to be clear on this.
Mm-hmm.
I just published a big essay on this. Part of it shows up in my book, but I've devoted a 40-page paper to what we're talking about now,
Mm-hmm.
what I call racial fluidity. And so the whole human race is white. Some of the human race sinned, and they got cursed with a black or brown skin. And they would have to lose that curse to inherit the celestial kingdom or exaltation, where they would be white again. Or, as the scriptures put it, white and delightsome. And how would they lose the curse? Well, they'd have to accept baptism into the church. They would have to find God's grace. They'd have to repent of their sins. And the brethren couldn't determine if they would lose the curse in mortality or in the resurrection. They couldn't determine when it would happen. But it would have to happen because the idea would be that black or brown skin was offensive in God's eyes, and they would have to lose that to be white again. And I just want to acknowledge right here and now that I know this is terribly jarring to our modern sensibilities, and it should be. I mean, of all the things that maybe I've read and talked and written about over the last several years, it's this idea of racial fluidity, that somehow your dark skin is a sign of a divine curse. I mean, that is so incredibly offensive, right? And so not all of the brethren believe this, by the way. I just want to be clear on this. Hugh Brown, David O. McKay, Spencer Kimball did not Spencer Kimball. Kimball did sadly believe in some of this stuff, but McKay, no. Brown, no. Elder Widsoe, no. Elder Benyon, no. There's others. So it's a very radical teaching for sure. But that was the scaffolding behind it, that everybody was white. Some people sinned. They got a curse. They would have to lose that curse again in order to inherit, the celestial kingdom. And in 1944, in the mid-20th century and before, this is when that doctrine was taught the most. And finally, in 1944, I found this in the Spencer W. Kimball papers. It was really interesting. It was a letter that the First Presidency wrote to a Latter-day Saint. I think it was a Latter-day Saint man. And the man said, I want to know, what will the color of the human race be? Well, I assume it'll be white in the hereafter. And the First Presidency, this is 1944, the First Presidency wrote this man, and they said that it is unknown the color of black, and I think it was black, they used the word Negro, is unknown the color of the Negroes in the hereafter. It is not the doctrine of the church that they'll be white. That's what they said in 1944. The problem with that is that some of the more hardline apostles are teaching this, including Joseph Fielding Smith. But when asked to go on record and own the doctrine and the teaching, the church sort of backed off a little bit. But if you look at the writings of some of the apostles, they're very, very clear about this. And in my book, there's an interesting interchange from 1954 where Mark A. Peterson had given this really, really aggressive anti-black racism talk at BYU to religious educators. After the talk, Elder Peterson and Joseph Fielding Smith, the two apostles, were there, and they took questions from the educators. And Hugh Nibley, the great Mormon apologist, asked a question, and he said, is it true that Negroes will lose their skin color in the resurrection or in mortality? He gave either option. And now this is off the record. This is not, they're not taping this. There's no transcript. It'll be published in the Improvement Era, which is the church's magazine at the time. And so whatever was said would be off the record. And Joseph Fielding Smith said, quote, "We have real, actual examples where Negroes' skin color has changed." I mean, there's no other way to interpret that metaphorically, that we have actual examples. And he never said that publicly in his writings, which is fascinating because in my opinion, he knew that would be controversial with Black people, but he did say it with Native Americans or Lamanites.
Mm-hmm. I remember hearing that in the 70s.
Oh, we've all heard it.
Yeah.
We've all heard it. And so even though the church hasn't taught that racial fluidity for a while now in the 70s, talk to any Black or brown Latter-day Saint over the age of 35, and I guarantee you they've heard that if they're righteous enough, their skin color will lighten. And of course, they'll tell you that either, laughingly, like, how absurd, this is just funny, or they'll say, not laughingly, this is disgusting. And
and I will just share
there are strands of that today that linger.
That we had a neighbor who married a Native American, and my parents said that she had become lighter. So
I know, this is one of the reasons why I wrote this book is because I want Latter-day Saints to understand this history. And I'm a historian, so it's important to preserve this history. And of course, history, just for the record, is an interpretive act. So these are my judgments and conclusions based on hundreds and hundreds of documents that I've seen that are restricted. They're First Presidency minutes in Quorum of the 12 Minutes and documents at BYU. And so the history is really important because you really can't move beyond this history and, frankly, reconcile with some of these past racial teachings unless you own them. And I've heard, even from people in my own family, when we've talked about this racial fluidity doctrine, my father would say, "Well, I've never heard that," or "I've never heard that in church today." And my response is, "Well, I hope you don't hear this in church today." Oh my. But I said, "Dad, that was the teaching of the church for so many years. And you wouldn't have heard Joseph Fielding Smith applying it to Black people because he would have been just absolutely vilified if he talked about that during the Civil Rights era, right?"
Mm-hmm.
But you certainly did read about his views on Native Americans because he published them by Desert Book. Answers to Gospel Questions, Doctrines of Salvation, all of that is in there, but it's directed towards Native Americans. Because the Book of Mormon privileges Lamanites or Native Americans and says very little about Black people, except, of course, the way they interpret certain passages with the curse of Cain and all of that. So anyway, that's a really controversial teaching, and I've often said to my dad and others, just because you haven't heard about it or it's not taught today doesn't mean that it wasn't once taught,
Mm-hmm.
And once you sort of put the foundation in place, you can understand how these things work.
Mm-hmm.
Elder Kimball gave a talk in 1960 when he was an apostle, and he talked about Lamanites leaving the reservation and living in the homes of Latter-day Saints, white Latter-day Saints.
Mm-hmm.
They would leave the reservation, and the idea was that they could be nurtured in Mormon teachings, they could perhaps receive a better education in public schools, and then they would go back home after the school year. And Elder Kimball stood up in General Conference and he showed pictures of, he called them Lamanite children. I don't like the word Lamanite just because it's a racialized construction that has some tough meanings, but we'll use the words that he used. He said, if you look at the pictures of these Lamanites here who left the reservation, or the Hogans as he called them, and to live in the homes of members, and compare them with the ones who stayed behind, these ones are lighter.
Mm-hmm.
These ones are darker.
Mm-hmm.
And what he meant by that was they've been nurtured in the gospel in these private homes, and it's had an effect on their skin color. And let me just say one last word about this that your listeners, I think, will find interesting. So that's that racial fluidity we're talking about. And in 1979, after President Kimball lifted the ban, a reporter from the LA Times named John Dart interview with President Kimball, and he had read the 1960 talk.
Oh, no.
And he said, "Mr. Kimball, can you provide actual examples of where the skin color turns lighter?" And, this is a tough question. This is a theological question, right? The way that Elder Benson interpreted the scripture. There's no science behind this. And President Kimball said, no, I can't. I guess you would need science to prove it. So he's caught in a tough position.
Right.
And even after he gave the talk in 1960, his son told me he wished he would never have given that talk because so many Latter-day Saints wrote him letters. And they said, Dear Elder Kimball, why are you linking skin color with moral purity? And the idea would be, in this case, moral impurity. And that's offensive. So he knew it was a controversial talk from the get-go. The journalist reminded him of that in 1979. And here's the part your listeners will find curious. It wasn't long after that 1979 talk where he convened a committee of 3 apostles, Tom Monson, Boyd Packer, and Bruce McConkie, and a handful of religion professors, some of whom were my old teachers at BYU.
Oh.
And they had cross-referenced and revised parts of the Book of Mormon. And the most critical verse of scripture that they revised was they took out white and delightsome and put in pure and delightsome. Now, the public motif for that was that they were just trying to go back to the original text, right? But that's the public relations line. The real line is that they had been embarrassed by this white and delightsome stuff as it applied to Lamanites, and they wanted to remove skin color from moral purity. And so that's why they took white and delightsome out.
So you're saying the original manuscripts didn't say pure, that said white?
The original manuscript said pure and delightsome, as I recall. And at some point in I think it was 1840, one of your listeners will correct me on this, I'm sure, but I think it was 1840, white and delightsome was put in. Which, in my opinion, what difference does it make? It was Joseph Smith either way, right?
Yeah, he was still alive in 1840.
The prophet was still the prophet in 1840. So maybe he thought the translation was wrong. I don't know. I can't get into his mind about why he did that. But the point is that he was responsible for both of those, pure and delightsome and white and delightsome. And so they wanted to get away from that controversial teaching, which was very prominent in the 20th century. Their magazines and literature and sermons always talked about this racial fluidity, that if you're righteous enough Lamanites, you lose your skin color. And that's one of the reasons why the early church leaders of the 19th century privileged them for redemption, is because they had to turn them white again. And so Black people in the church are reading these Book of Mormon verses. And even though it does not, talk about Black Africans or African American or anybody, it's Lamanites, they want to know how those curses apply to them. So that's how they're reading these scriptures. And so the Book of Mormon is not the most important proof text for the ban, but it is a proof text. And that's something that's hard for people to hear, because the Book of Mormon is some of those verses, although they've been toned down over the years, there are still some difficult verses that deal with race that people of color in the church find problematic.
Well, this reminds me of your talk that you gave at BOMSA last year. Because, and by the way, you should all go to BOMSA up in Logan in October.
Tell them what it is.
Book of Mormon Studies Association. We've talked about it. Okay. Joe Spencer is the new president. Chris Thomas has finished his 4-year term, although it's supposed to be 3, but he extended 1 year. And oh, by the way, I heard there's a new president of John Whitmer Association. Do you know who that is?
I am the president-elect. I will, take office the year after next, maybe. It's a kind of a 3-year process.
Oh, I thought it was this fall.
No, it's you get put into the executive team, as it's called, and it's probably wise, I think, the way they do it, which is you learn the ropes and all of that sort of thing, and then so the president-elect or the person who's doing it this year is Mark Staker, who works for the church. And the guy this year, Kyle Walker, works at BYU, Idaho. So my tenure is after Mark Staker's.
Okay.
So I'm still a year and a half out. So
all right. So another sneak peek. I don't know if that's public, but it is now.
It is now. No, it is. It is. It's been announced. So that's okay.
And I know I'll just mention Ben Park is next year's Mormon History Association president too.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Ben will be great.
We got some great scholars on there.
Yeah. So anyway, that's one of the most difficult race teachings is this racial fluidity. There are a couple of other ones too.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matthew Harris. And if you don't have a copy yet, it's been sold out. But go to gospeltangents.com/contest. You could win an autographed copy if I pull out your name. So we'll do that at the conclusion of the interview. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about Marion D. Hanks. I don't know how Matt got those amazing notes.
Right? Benyon was a former apostle whose family defied convention and donated the papers to BYU rather than the church archives.
Yay!
Where they are they're put away, a vault within a vault, and throw away the keys or eviscerate the code so nobody can get access.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.